The year is 1347, a shadow falls across Europe, a creeping terror arriving on ships laden with spices and silks from the east. This is no ordinary invader, no army marching under banners of war. This is the Black Death, a relentless plague that will forever alter the course of history. Imagine a world where the very air you breathe carries a death sentence, where gruesome boils erupt on your skin, a macabre calling card of an invisible enemy. The Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic, ravaged Europe with unparalleled ferocity. Entire families wiped out in days, villages transformed into ghost towns, the stench of death clinging to the air like a shroud. Within a few short years, nearly half of Europe's population would be gone, victims of a microscopic killer that spared no one, rich or poor, noble or peasant. The sheer scale of the devastation is difficult to comprehend. Mass graves overflowed, unable to contain the sheer volume of corpses. The church, once a beacon of hope, struggled to explain the relentless carnage, its authority shaken to its core. Amidst the despair and chaos, the old order, the rigid structure of medieval society, began to crumble, creating a vacuum that would give rise to a radically different world. Before the Black Death's chilling embrace, Europe existed under a system known as feudalism. Imagine a world where your destiny is predetermined at birth, where the vast majority of people, the peasantry, toiled on land owned by wealthy lords, their lives dictated by the seasons and the whims of their superiors. This was a world of limited social mobility. You were born a peasant, you lived as a peasant, and you died as a peasant. The church reinforced this rigid structure, preaching that one's place in society was divinely ordained. Ambition for most was a luxury they couldn't afford. Survival was paramount, and the idea of challenging the established order was unthinkable. The Black Death shattered this seemingly immutable reality. As the plague ripped through Europe, it didn't discriminate between lord and peasant. Death, the great equalizer, exposed the fragility of the feudal system and the mortality of those in power. The very foundation of medieval society, built on land ownership and a captive labor force, began to crack under the weight of unimaginable loss. To understand the seismic shift the Black Death triggered, we must delve deeper into the mechanics of feudalism. Picture a pyramid. At the very top resided the king, a distant figure who granted land to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service. These nobles in turn divided their land among lesser lords, who then relied on peasants to work the land. This system, while seemingly stable, was inherently imbalanced. Peasants tied to the land had little incentive to innovate or improve their lot. They were trapped in a cycle of subsistence living, their labor lining the pockets of their lords, who lived lives of relative luxury and leisure. The Black Death, in its cruel indifference, exposed the flaws in this system. With a drastically reduced workforce, the surviving peasants found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. The demand for labor skyrocketed, and those who once toiled in obscurity suddenly possessed a valuable commodity: their ability to work. The Black Death, while undeniably a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, inadvertently sowed the seeds of change. The old order, shaken to its core, could no longer rely on tradition and coercion. The survivors, faced with the fragility of life and the collapse of familiar structures, began to question the established order. The plague in its wake created a world ripe for innovation and upheaval. The rigid social hierarchy of feudalism, where birth determined destiny, began to give way to a system where individual merit and hard work held increasing value. The seeds of capitalism, of a market driven by supply and demand, were sown in the ashes of the Black Death. To truly grasp the economic earthquake the Black Death unleashed, we have to start with the most basic human need: food. Imagine a world where overnight the hands that sowed, tended and harvested your crops simply vanished. The plague didn't just kill people, it crippled the very lifeblood of medieval society, agriculture. With so many dead, fields lay fallow, crops rotted on the vine. The once predictable rhythm of planting and harvesting descended into chaos. Famine, a specter that always lurked at the edges of medieval life, now threatened to consume entire communities. The shortage of food drove up prices, making survival a daily struggle for those fortunate enough to have escaped the plague's grasp. This agricultural collapse had a ripple effect throughout the medieval economy. Trade, already disrupted by the plague's devastation, slowed to a trickle. Towns and cities, once reliant on the countryside for sustenance, faced dwindling supplies and skyrocketing prices. The Black Death, in its wake, exposed the fragility of a system entirely dependent on a large, readily exploitable labor pool. The Black Death upended the balance of power. With labor scarce and wages rising, the ruling class, accustomed to a surplus of workers, found themselves in uncharted territory. Their solution? To try and turn back the clock, to legislate their way out of an economic reality they couldn't control. Enter the Statute of Laborers in England, a desperate attempt to maintain the pre-plague status quo. Passed in 1351, this law sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from seeking better opportunities. It mandated that able-bodied men and women work for whoever offered them employment, essentially outlawing the very concept of a free labor market. The Statute of Laborers, in essence, was an attempt to stuff the genie of economic change back into the bottle. But the plague, in its brutal efficiency, had fundamentally altered the landscape. The dead couldn't be forced to work, and the living, emboldened by their newfound leverage, often ignored the statute's provisions. The law, while intended to maintain order, often had the opposite effect, fueling resentment and unrest among the peasantry. The Statute of Laborers, far from quelling unrest, ignited it. The peasants, having tasted economic freedom, were no longer content to accept the meager existence dictated by their social superiors. In 1381, England erupted in what became known as the Peasants Revolt, a visceral expression of simmering frustration and a demand for a fairer share of the economic pie. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the revolt spread like wildfire across the English countryside. Peasants marched on London demanding an end to serfdom, fair wages, and an end to the oppressive taxes that burdened them. The revolt, while ultimately crushed, sent shockwaves through the ruling class. The Peasants' Revolt, though brutally suppressed, demonstrated the limits of control in a world where labor was no longer abundant and easily controlled. The old order, built on the backs of an unyielding peasantry, now faced a new reality, one where workers, emboldened by their economic importance, were willing to fight for their rights. The Black Death's economic aftershocks weren't limited to labor shortages and social unrest. The plague also ushered in a period of rampant inflation. With fewer goods available and more money in circulation due to inheritance, the value of currency plummeted. What once cost a penny now cost a shilling, putting even basic necessities out of reach for many. This inflation hit the poorest the hardest. While landowners and merchants could often adjust their prices, wage earners found their earnings shrinking in real terms. The Black Death, while claiming lives indiscriminately, had a disproportionate economic impact, widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. This economic instability further eroded the foundations of feudalism. Peasants, struggling to survive, became disillusioned with a system that seemed to offer them nothing but hardship. Many abandoned the land, seeking opportunities in towns and cities, further disrupting the traditional economic order. Yet, amidst the chaos and despair, the Black Death also created opportunities for advancement unimaginable in the rigid hierarchy of feudalism. With labor in high demand, skilled workers, artisans, and those willing to learn new trades found themselves in a position to bargain for better wages and conditions. For the first time, a person's worth wasn't solely determined by their birthright. Talent, skill, and hard work became increasingly valuable commodities, opening doors for upward mobility that had long been shut to the lower classes. This shift in economic power paved the way for the emergence of a new class, the middle class. This nascent middle class, with its entrepreneurial spirit and focus on individual achievement, would become a driving force in the centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the eventual rise of capitalism. The Black Death, in its cruel irony, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately transform European society, shifting the balance of power and creating a world where individual initiative and innovation could flourish. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it exposed a fatal flaw at the heart of feudalism: its reliance on a captive, immobile workforce. For centuries, the peasantry had been tethered to the land, their destinies preordained by birth and bound to the whims of their lords. This system, however, could not survive the sudden catastrophic loss of life. With fields lying fallow and villages decimated, the surviving peasants found themselves in an unprecedented position. Labor, once a cheap and abundant resource, had become the most sought-after commodity. The lords, accustomed to unquestioned authority, suddenly faced a dilemma: how to entice a dwindling workforce to stay put and maintain their estates. The traditional bonds of obligation and fealty, once the bedrock of feudal society, began to erode. Peasants, no longer bound by the same sense of duty or fear of starvation, realized they had a choice. They could demand better treatment, higher wages, or simply move on to lands where their labor was more valued. The Black Death, in its brutal calculus, had shifted the balance of power. The surviving peasants, far from passive victims, recognized their newfound leverage. They could now negotiate for better terms, demand higher wages, or simply refuse to work under oppressive conditions. This was a revolutionary concept in a world where obedience and subservience had been the norm for generations. For the first time, the value of labor wasn't determined solely by a lord's decree, but by the forces of supply and demand. Skilled laborers, artisans, and those willing to learn new trades found themselves in high demand, their services eagerly sought after by landowners desperate to maintain their holdings. This shift towards a more market-driven system wasn't without its challenges. The lords, accustomed to dictating the terms of labor, resisted this newfound independence. Laws were passed, like the Statute of Laborers, in a futile attempt to suppress wages and force workers back into their pre-plague roles. For centuries, land had been the source of power and wealth in feudal society. It was the foundation of the social order, passed down through generations of nobility, and worked by peasants tied to their lords' estates. The Black Death, however, disrupted this ancient equation. With so many dead, land, once a scarce and tightly controlled resource, became more readily available. Nobles, their ranks depleted, found themselves with inherited estates they lacked the manpower to maintain. Some, desperate for cash, were forced to sell off portions of their landholdings. Others, eager to attract and retain workers, offered more favorable terms, including the possibility of tenancy or even outright ownership. This shift towards a more fluid land market had profound implications. It challenged the very foundation of feudalism, which rested on the idea of a fixed social order dictated by land ownership. As more peasants gained access to land, either through purchase or more favorable tenancy agreements, the traditional power structure began to erode. The Black Death not only reshaped the relationship between lords and peasants, it fostered the growth of towns and cities as centers of commerce and innovation. With labor in high demand, skilled artisans and craftsmen flocked to urban centers, where their skills could command a premium. This concentration of talent led to the rise of guilds, organizations that would shape the economic landscape for centuries to come. Guilds, essentially medieval versions of trade unions, provided a framework for organizing labor, setting standards for quality, and protecting the interests of their members. They offered apprenticeships to train new generations of craftsmen, ensuring a steady supply of skilled labor. They also acted as social safety nets, providing support for members facing hardship or illness. The rise of guilds marked a significant departure from the feudal system, where economic activity had largely been confined to rural estates. It fostered the growth of a more specialized and interconnected economy, with goods and services flowing more freely between towns and cities. The dawn of competition. Innovation in the face of crisis. The Black Death, for all its devastation, fostered a spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship. With labor scarce and traditional ways of life disrupted, people were forced to find new solutions to age-old problems. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. Farmers, faced with a shortage of laborers, experimented with new agricultural techniques and labor-saving devices. Craftsmen, eager to meet the demands of a growing market, refined their skills and developed new technologies. Merchants, seeking to capitalize on shifting trade patterns, explored new markets and established new trade routes. This surge in innovation wasn't limited to practical matters. The Black Death also had a profound impact on art, literature, and philosophy, leading to a questioning of traditional beliefs and the emergence of new ways of thinking. The world, it seemed, was being remade, not just economically but intellectually and culturally as well. The cracks widen. Feudalism's grip begins to slip. Imagine a mighty oak, its roots sunk deep into the earth for centuries, seemingly invincible. Then, a slow rot sets in, weakening its core, making it vulnerable to the winds of change. Such was the fate of feudalism in the wake of the Black Death. What was once an unshakable system, a rigid hierarchy dictating every aspect of life, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The plague's economic aftershocks had loosened the once unbreakable bonds between lord and peasant. The scarcity of labor empowered those who toiled the land, giving them leverage they had never possessed before. No longer content with mere subsistence, they demanded better treatment, fairer wages, and a say in their own destinies. The feudal lords, accustomed to absolute authority, found themselves in uncharted waters. Some, clinging to the old ways, resorted to increasingly desperate measures, attempting to enforce outdated laws and suppress the growing discontent. Others, recognizing the winds of change, began to adapt, offering concessions and seeking ways to accommodate the demands of a newly empowered workforce. The rise of the merchant class. A new power emerges. As feudalism faltered, a new force arose to fill the void: the merchant class. The plague created opportunities for those who dealt in trade and commerce. Merchants, with their connections and access to resources, stepped in to meet the demands of a changing world. These medieval entrepreneurs established new trade routes, sought out new markets, and embraced innovation. They financed expeditions, invested in new technologies, and took risks that the risk-averse nobility often shunned. In doing so, they amassed wealth and influence that challenged the established order. The rise of the merchant class had profound implications for the development of capitalism. As feudalism waned, cities became magnets for opportunity, drawing in those seeking to escape the confines of rural life. The influx of people, skills, and ideas created a vibrant, dynamic environment that fostered innovation and challenged traditional social norms. Within these urban centers, the rigid social hierarchies of feudalism began to break down. People from diverse backgrounds, merchants, artisans, laborers, scholars, interacted and collaborated, their relationships based not on birthright but on shared interests and mutual benefit. Universities flourished, attracting scholars from across Europe, fostering intellectual debate and scientific inquiry. The printing press made knowledge more accessible, further eroding the church's monopoly on information and challenging traditional ways of thinking. The decline of feudalism and the rise of cities helped lay the groundwork for a more participatory form of governance. As people gained economic independence and social mobility, they began to demand a greater say in how they were ruled. The concept of citizenship, with its attendant rights and responsibilities, began to take root. Guilds and other civic organizations became powerful forces for change, advocating for policies that promoted economic growth and social justice. They challenged the absolute authority of monarchs and nobles, demanding accountability and a voice in government. The seeds planted in the aftermath of the Black Death would ultimately blossom into new forms of governance that challenged the very foundations of absolute rule. The demise of feudalism was not a sudden collapse but a protracted process, marked by resistance and attempts to cling to power. The old guard, the landed nobility, did not relinquish their privileges willingly. Peasant uprisings like the English Peasants Revolt of 1381 highlighted the growing tensions between the ruling class and those they sought to control. These rebellions, though ultimately suppressed, exposed the fragility of a system that relied on coercion and the suppression of individual aspirations. Yet, the tide of history had turned. The economic and social forces unleashed by the Black Death proved too powerful to contain. A new era was dawning, one shaped by the forces of individualism, capitalism, and the pursuit of a more just and equitable society. Imagine the bustling wharves of Venice or Genoa, the air thick with the scent of exotic spices, the cries of merchants hawking their wares in a dozen languages. The Black Death, while devastating, had inadvertently breathed new life into trade. With feudalism crumbling, merchants seized the opportunity to connect a world hungry for goods and desperate for new beginnings. Trade routes, once primarily land-based and fraught with danger, now increasingly turned seaward. The Mediterranean became a vibrant artery of commerce, connecting Europe to the riches of the East. This surge in trade wasn't just about material goods, it was about the exchange of ideas, cultures, and technologies. In the wake of the Black Death, a new breed of power player emerged, the merchant prince. These weren't just traders, they were savvy investors, shrewd negotiators, and masters of logistics, building vast commercial empires that rivaled the holdings of the old nobility. Families like the Medici of Florence and the Fuggers of Germany amassed fortunes that dwarfed the treasuries of kings. They financed wars, bankrolled expeditions, and patronized the arts, their influence extending far beyond the counting house and into the corridors of power. Merchants, once relegated to the fringes of the aristocracy, now demanded recognition and a say in how they were governed. They challenged the old order, demanding policies that favored trade, protected their interests, and recognized their growing influence. Trade, especially on a grand scale, required more than just goods and ships. It demanded sophisticated financial instruments to manage risk, facilitate transactions, and fuel expansion. Early banks, often run by families like the Medici, provided a vital service to merchants' credit. No longer limited by the amount of cash on hand, traders could now secure loans to finance expeditions, purchase goods, and expand their operations. This injection of capital fueled the growth of trade, allowing merchants to take on bigger risks and reap even greater rewards. But the rise of banking wasn't without its risks. The intricate web of credit, while fueling economic expansion, also created new vulnerabilities. The merchant revolution wasn't confined to the familiar waters of the Mediterranean. Driven by a thirst for profit and a hunger for exotic goods, European explorers ventured further afield, pushing the boundaries of the known world and laying the groundwork for a truly globalized economy. Portuguese navigators explored the coast of Africa, seeking a sea route to the riches of the East Indies. Christopher Columbus, seeking a westward passage to Asia, stumbled upon the Americas, inadvertently opening up a new world ripe for exploitation. These voyages of discovery, while driven by noble ideals of exploration and scientific curiosity, were also inextricably linked to the pursuit of profit. The Merchant Revolution, while ushering in a new era of economic dynamism and innovation, also laid bare the potential for exploitation and inequality inherent in a system driven solely by the pursuit of profit. The quest for riches, unchecked by moral considerations, led to the enslavement of millions, the plunder of entire continents, and the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. The transatlantic slave trade, financed by European merchants and fueled by the demand for sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops, became a cornerstone of the emerging global economy. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, condemned to a life of brutal labor on plantations that generated vast wealth for their European owners. This period also saw the rise of colonialism, as European powers, driven by a combination of economic ambition and imperial rivalry, carved up vast swaths of the globe. This darker side of the merchant revolution serves as a stark reminder that economic progress without moral constraint can come at a terrible human cost. Centuries have passed since the Black Death ravaged Europe, yet its echoes reverberate through time, reminding us of the enduring power of pandemics to reshape societies, expose vulnerabilities, and challenge the very foundations of our world. Just as the bubonic plague forever altered the course of medieval Europe, so too have modern pandemics, from the 1918 influenza to the COVID-19 crisis, forced us to confront our own mortality and question the systems we have built. Each pandemic, while unique in its biological and social context, has exposed the fault lines in our societies, revealing the disparities in healthcare access, the precarity of our interconnected world, and the persistent inequalities that leave some disproportionately vulnerable to disease and economic hardship. The lessons learned from past pandemics, both in terms of public health measures and social resilience, have undoubtedly saved countless lives. Yet as we grapple with the ongoing challenges of emerging infectious diseases, climate change, and globalization, the Black Death's legacy stands as a stark reminder that our vulnerability to pandemics is not just a matter of science but also of social justice, economic equity, and our collective responsibility to create a more resilient and equitable world. The Black Death, in its wake, set in motion a chain of events that led to the rise of capitalism, a system that has come to dominate the globe, shaping our lives in profound and often contradictory ways. It's a system that has fueled unprecedented economic growth, innovation, and technological advancement, lifting millions out of poverty and transforming the way we live, work, and interact with the world. Yet capitalism, like the invisible hand Adam Smith famously described, often operates with a logic of its own, driven by the relentless pursuit of profit, competition, and the accumulation of capital. This relentless drive, while a powerful engine for innovation, can also lead to exploitation, inequality, and the degradation of the environment. The Black Death's legacy in this context serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that unchecked economic forces without moral constraint and a commitment to social justice can exacerbate existing inequalities and create new forms of suffering. The challenge we face today is to harness the innovative potential of capitalism while mitigating its inherent flaws, to create an economic system that works for everyone, not just a privileged few. This requires a commitment to social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and a more equitable distribution of the benefits of economic growth. The Black Death, in its devastation, spurred innovation out of necessity. Faced with labor shortages and economic disruption, people were forced to find new ways to work, produce goods, and organize their societies. This spirit of innovation, while born of crisis, laid the groundwork for centuries of technological advancement, ultimately leading to the world we inhabit today. Yet, as we stand on the cusp of a new technological revolution, driven by artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and automation, we must confront the ethical dilemmas posed by a world increasingly shaped by market forces and driven by the pursuit of progress. The question we must ask ourselves is not simply can we, but rather should we? What are the social, ethical, and environmental implications of our technological choices? The challenge we face is to ensure that our technological advancements serve humanity as a whole, not just the interests of a privileged few or the relentless logic of the market. The Black Death, while a harrowing chapter in human history, offers valuable lessons for navigating the challenges of our own time. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable crisis, humanity possesses an indomitable spirit, a capacity for innovation, and a yearning for a better world. The question we face today is not whether we can build a more just, equitable, and sustainable future, but rather what choices we are willing to make to ensure that such a future becomes a reality. The Black Death's legacy compels us to acknowledge the interconnectedness of our world, to recognize that the pursuit of individual gain at the expense of the collective good is not a sustainable path. It challenges us to create economic systems that prioritize well-being over endless growth, that value social justice and environmental sustainability as much as profit margins and shareholder value. The Black Death, in its devastation, reminds us that we have the power to shape our destiny, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to create a world where pandemics are not inevitable harbingers of societal collapse, but challenges that we face together, with compassion, ingenuity, and an unwavering commitment to a future worthy of our shared humanity. The year 2020. A new virus emerges, invisible, insidious, spreading across the globe with terrifying speed. Empty streets, overwhelmed hospitals, a collective sense of fear and uncertainty grip the world. While the Black Death may seem like a distant horror confined to history books, the COVID-19 pandemic thrust us face to face with an uncomfortable truth. Our vulnerability to infectious disease is not a relic of the past, but a persistent threat in our interconnected world. Just as the Black Death exposed the flaws of feudalism, COVID-19 has laid bare the cracks in our own systems. Healthcare disparities, economic inequalities, and the precarity of gig work were thrust into the spotlight. The pandemic became a magnifying glass, amplifying existing injustices and forcing us to confront the consequences of decades of policy choices. The parallels between the Black Death and our own pandemic age are chilling. It offers us a choice: cling to the broken structures of the past, or seize the opportunity to build a more just and resilient world. The Black Death, in its wake, laid the groundwork for capitalism's ascent. From the ashes of feudalism rose a dynamic new system, one that unleashed innovation, fueled centuries of technological advancement, and created unimaginable wealth. But this progress has come at a cost. Capitalism, while a powerful engine for growth, has also created vast inequalities, exploited vulnerable populations, and ravaged the environment in its relentless pursuit of profit. We live in a world where a handful of individuals hold more wealth than half the global population, where automation threatens to displace millions of workers, where climate change, fueled by unchecked consumption, jeopardizes the very planet we inhabit. The question we must confront is this: can capitalism, a system born from crisis, evolve to address the crises it has created? The Black Death reminds us that systems are not immutable. They are human constructs, capable of being reshaped and redefined. If we are to create a future where prosperity is shared, where opportunity is abundant, and where the planet is protected for generations to come, we must move beyond the narrow pursuit of profit and embrace a more holistic vision of progress, one that values people and the planet alongside profits. The Black Death wasn't just a story of death and devastation. It was also a story of resilience, adaptation, and the power of collective action. The peasants who demanded fair wages, the guilds that organized for better working conditions, the merchants who financed exploration and innovation, they all played a role in shaping the world that emerged from the plague's shadow. Their actions remind us that we too have the power to rewrite the rules and create a more just and equitable future. The challenges we face today, from climate change to economic inequality to global pandemics, may seem insurmountable. But the Black Death, in its own time, was a crisis of unimaginable scale. And yet, humanity not only survived, it thrived. We have the capacity to overcome even the most daunting obstacles, but it will require a collective effort, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to building a better world for all. This is the essence of conscious capitalism, a recognition that businesses have a responsibility not just to their shareholders but to their employees, their communities, and the planet. It's about embracing a triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. It's about recognizing that our economic system is not an unyielding force of nature but a human creation, capable of being reshaped to serve the needs of all. We stand at a crossroads, much like the survivors of the Black Death did centuries ago. The choices we make today will determine the course of history for generations to come. Will we cling to the broken systems of the past, or will we seize the opportunity to create a future worthy of our shared humanity? The Black Death, for all its horror, reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope endures. It reminds us that crisis can be a catalyst for change, that out of destruction can come renewal. It reminds us that we are not passive bystanders in the unfolding drama of history, but active participants with the power to shape our own destiny. The future is not predetermined, it is a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of our choices. Let us choose wisely. Let us choose compassion over indifference, cooperation over competition, sustainability over short-term gain. Let us choose to build a world where pandemics are not inevitable harbingers of doom but challenges that we face together, united in our shared humanity and our unwavering commitment to a future where all can thrive. Like, comment and share for more history tips. ED Experience, explore, engage, elevate.